They're, we say you quit. It's like driving a different vehicle.
Okay, well, at 5 o'clock, John, we got a list on?
No,
We don't.
she
Okay.
said she would call her when she had a problem, so
Okay.
I took that as other things going on and start with.
All right. Do you want, can we start now?
I'll let you know. That's up to you.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we'll get going if we hear from her, we can get her in, so. That's all I've got. Go ahead, Scott.
All right, so I think most of the show is prepared presentation is going to be Josh. So just this here. So new face, Sterling. So I saw an email from you about that. So John is cross training today with Sterling. I think anybody else? So with that, I will let Josh kind of run through the presentation. I would say this presentation lends itself to lecture style with questions at the end. But it's always council's prerogative if you want to hold us up during part of the presentation. Certainly, if there's clarity on a specific topic, go ahead. But I think the way that, at least the way I edited the presentation when it was provided, I edited it with the assumption that Josh can run through a bunch of the framework for us, lay out where staff is at, and then there would be, you figured there'd be significant discussion by the council after the. That doesn't mean we can't stop during it, but just a, I guess, an asterisk at the beginning of the presentation. And then we're, again, in a workshop format, we're not necessarily looking for direction or action by the council. This is to provide some significant background, help you understand the status, what we understand it as staff, help you understand what we think your options are, and then there would be some going forward. But it doesn't mean that we don't expect any discussion or dialogue today that will help maybe funnel some of what we think the council is doing, or some idea in the council direction, but there's no votes or anything on the council meeting tonight based on this workshop. So I appreciate the patience of the council. I know some of you wanted to have this workshop quite some time ago. And I had said, based on the schedule, this is where I think we can do. So it's probably, in my mind, it's a little earlier than it needs to be, but it's, I'm sure, later than some of you would like. And to be fair, it's later than some cities, are taking on this question. So I realized that that's kind of on me as we were trying to sort everything out with the new finance director. I didn't want to do it as the acting finance director, so I thought we'd wait till we had the new. So here we are. Josh, take it away.
All right, thank you, everybody. So as Scott mentioned, really what we're going to be talking about is an overview of the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. I'll probably be saying ARPA a lot. And then talking about options for us as a city to use our allocation of funding under the program. So we'll go overview, options, some high level kind of considerations or a bit of a framework, discussion of some best practices, things like that. And then we'll ultimately get down to a kind of a recommendation. So within ARPA, which is a $1.9 trillion act, there's $350 billion earmarked for what's called the state and local fiscal recovery funds. And you can see in the slide, kind of at a high level, how that's being allocated across the whole country. So the states are getting a significant piece, local governments, tribal governments, and then there's this sort of $4.5 billion other miscellaneous that are for things like, energy and water household assistance, things like that. It's kind of a catch-all category and more. So there are in ARPA other programs available that are just worth mentioning. They're not necessarily pertinent to us today, but quickly, small businesses, restaurants and bars, schools, housing, transportation and infrastructure, which is a kind of a separate piece that we'll be talking about here, public health and housing, if I haven't mentioned that already. So according to the state's legislative fiscal bureau, the Wisconsin portion of the state and local fiscal recovery funds are broken down as follows. So counties will receive 1.129 billion. Metro cities will receive 788 million. And then there's 399 million for other non-counties, which are essentially the non-entitlement communities in Wisconsin, of which we would be one of those. Our portion, then last but not least, is 1.677 million. We have already received half of that. We will be receiving the second tranche of that in June. So we've received half of our 1.677. I'm going to I think I'll probably be kind of moving this around as needed. There is kind of an unrelated but relevant piece to all of this too, which is the bipartisan infrastructure law. So our city engineer, Todd, kind of received word, for lack of a better word on my part, that the state's ARPA funding is enabling them to increase the pool of funds they make available for things like the surface transportation program, the local bridge program, and potentially the local road improvements program. So I'll touch on this again a little bit in the presentation about how that's kind of relevant to our discussion here, but just worth mentioning that now that's an unrelated but relevant piece to ARPA. And then there are various infrastructure opportunities within the bipartisan infrastructure law. Those are outside of the framework of ARPA, but are competitive grant opportunities that we could potentially look to seize upon. So options for using our 1.677 million. So we can replace lost revenue with that. And when the Treasury first put out what they call their interim rule, the revenue loss category had sort of a convoluted, complicated formula that you had to do to calculate what your revenue loss was as a result of the pandemic. The Treasury took a lot of feedback from local governments across the country. There was a pretty significant input phase where they were receiving a lot of feedback. And as a result of that, they put out a final rule which changed how they're calculating and providing this revenue loss category. So instead of a calculation, cities are now able to essentially just make a one-time revenue loss election of up to $10 million. And again, for lack of a better word, it's sort of no questions asked by the Treasury. So our 1.677 million would be completely covered by this revenue loss category. It's available for things like government services. So, you know, what does that mean? It's any service traditionally provided by government is what the final rule says. So fairly broad interpretation there. There are some specific enumerated examples that they provided, which includes things like road, building and maintenance, other infrastructure, general government administration, staff and administrative facilities, environmental remediation, and provision of police, fire, and other public safety services, which would include the purchase of fire trucks and police vehicles. And obviously, any traditional service provided by government, so potentially a whole lot more. So that's one eligible expense category. Another is support for public health and economic response. A very commonly cited specific enumerated example that I've seen cited in publications and webinars I've attended is assisting impacted households and small businesses. Basically, some form of a loan program or a grant program. You can use this funding to essentially capitalize those programs with. An additional category is premium pay for eligible workers. Now, you could certainly make the case that anybody in local government has responded to COVID-19 in some way, shape, or form during the pandemic. But eligible workers are more narrowly defined to be things that you would more commonly associate with protective services at the county level of government, your public health employees, your human services employees. You can offer a maximum of $13 per hour per employee to a maximum of $25,000 per eligible worker if you were to go with this eligible use category. Of course, you can go with more than one category. But that's sort of the rules and the frameworks for this one. And then there is a separate eligible use category for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure that may be somewhat duplicative with other bipartisan infrastructure law opportunities. There also is a $10 billion coronavirus capital projects fund that's also part of ARPA. This is potentially duplicative. So we recognize that some of these pools of money, that there may be some duplication there that we need to further flesh out as we all go through this and get more guidance from state and federal levels. Just very quickly, I want to touch on some ineligible uses. So you can't offset any levy decreases that may have been enacted due to the pandemic, can't make deposits to pension funds, can't drive down debt service with it or replenish reserves. So those last two pieces, what the Treasury says essentially is it needs to be a prospective or proactive use of the funding. It's not retroactive as far as debt or reserve replenishment goes. It needs to be kind of a forward-looking use of funds. So now we're kind of getting out of background and we're getting into some kind of broader considerations, things like best practices. So it would certainly be a best practice to avoid using ARPA money to create essentially a structural deficit. So simply put, one-time revenues are most appropriately used for one-time uses. Take a one-time revenue and you kind of commit yourself to an ongoing expense. At some point down the road, you're going to create a deficit that we would see, flow through things like our fiscal planning process. Consider the most appropriate level of government for use of funds. So for some of those enumerated or unenumerated uses like public health, human services, are those most appropriate for the county level of government with a human services department, a public health department? Where do we choose to create that kind of transition, so to speak? And then consider existing city priorities. So obviously as a council, you've already kind of informed staff of what your priorities are for the next 2 years through a biennial budget process, through the next 5 through a capital improvement plan. We do operate under strategic initiatives. Things like ensuring financial stability, quality municipal services, economic vitality, and connected community, of which there are a number of bullet points of kind of tangible work products that we're working on to accomplish those initiatives, or to support those initiatives rather. Considering the fiscal plan and how does our use of funds affect our fiscal plan, which in turn flows through to our operating budget. And again, so going back to that first point about one-time revenues and one-time uses, how do our choices impact our operating budget or not? And then capital improvement plans. So we've got a list of projects already that we're contemplating accomplishing over the next 5 years. That's one framework that we might choose to consider our use of funding within. So staff's kind of high-level recommendation is that we essentially take our 1.677 million and we claim all of that as revenue loss. The federal government offers streamlined reporting requirements to do that, which would make Sam happy. But in a more serious sense, when you go through those eligible use categories, there are significant reporting requirements attached with those, which take staff time and some amount of overhead cost and things like that. By going this route, the federal government, although they haven't clearly defined what it will look like yet, they have offered that there will be streamlined reporting requirements if you choose to go this route. I think they are beginning to understand kind of how much back-end work is attached to all of the money that's now out there and available. And again, it is the most flexible of all the options. So I kind of went through some, that very broad framework of any service traditionally provided by a government. That is the most flexible use category of the ones available to us. So again, I've touched on some of the examples that they provide. Going back to an earlier point I made about the bipartisan infrastructure law and surface transportation program, local bridge program, local road improvement program. So those have some amount of local match associated with them, 10%, 20%, it varies by program. At this point, in the Treasury's final rule, they do indicate that we can use ARPA money as local match for other opportunities that have been made available. So you're taking your ARPA and you're kind of compounding your benefit there a little bit. So that's one more reason to go with the revenue loss category. That ability to leverage your money and use it as local match for other opportunities is only provided for if you go with the revenue loss eligible use category. And there is a fairly permissive framework for capital costs. So the Treasury makes a distinction between enumerated uses, of which there are oftentimes only a handful of examples, like with this revenue loss election, they only enumerate 6 examples. But there are then this sort of unenumerated possible uses that you essentially kind of have to run by them and see if you get the okay. And what they're saying is, within the revenue loss election category, if you elect to do a capital project or incur a capital cost that's less than $1 million, there is no written justification required, whether it's an enumerated use or not, more important. So again, lots of flexibility with this option. That's what staff at a high level is recommending this one. Now we're transitioning into something that's a little more narrowly focused. And the administrator's recommended use for state and local fiscal recovery funds. So within our capital improvement program, we've got 5 years of projects that we have already committed ourselves to. What this would essentially entail is that we take projects that are in the out years of the plan, contemplate bringing some of those forward, because not every project in our CIP is necessarily eligible. So we've identified some that we believe are. Roll them forward and essentially get them done and apply our ARPA money to those. And so you can see a number of specific projects that we have in mind. I do want to call attention to a couple of these. So placemaking projects, you're not going to find this in the CIP. This is essentially a combination of our wayfinding program and some of the downtown streetscape furnishings that are in the CIP. So we're kind of combine those and call it placemaking projects. So just wanted to call your attention to that one. And then at the bottom is another one I want to call out because this goes back to my earlier discussion of impact on operating budget and how ARPA is going to kind of flow through all of this. So in our CIP, we do have our City Hall Fund, which is an internal service fund. And without going into so much detail as to bore you, what that essentially is a fund where we have our costs for maintaining City Hall. Those costs are then allocated out to the departments that occupy the building. So it finds its way back to the general fund and other funds potentially is what that essentially means. By applying our ARPA money to as many of those City Hall projects as we believe we can, will essentially reduce the need for that to find its way back to the general fund and other funds. So that would have a very real kind of tangible impact in the operating budget. It would kind of reduce the needed transfer from general fund and others into this fund, make it available for other uses potentially. So this is the last slide before we wrap up. Some additional, I guess, call it recommendations continued, but it's kind of really coming full circle back to considerations and kind of opening it up for you all as council to discuss. How we're kind of contemplating this last slide that I just went over is, by rolling those projects forward, getting them accomplished, you're essentially creating some space on the back end of our current CIP then to, as a council, contemplate some additional projects that you might want to see accomplished. But again, ensuring that what we first do is kind of check the boxes of the commitments that we've already committed ourselves to through existing processes and adopted plans. So we could reduce planned levy use on the back end of the CIP, and allow for further discussion by council as to kind of what you want to do with that. Alternatively, whether it's in the out years of the CIP or even now, if you as a council would so choose, we could certainly have a discussion with you all about kind of your, what we call a wish list in here, but are there projects that aren't currently enumerated on our end in some existing plan that you would like to see accomplished nevertheless? Could we use our ARPA dollars to leverage our portion of the funding with other organizations in the area to some greater project, greater good, so to speak? Or are there some specific COVID impacts that you would like to see addressed? And then I guess there's not a fourth bullet point, but I would just say, or is there something else? So that's kind of where we're going to leave this off. We're going to kick it over for discussion, for questions. I do just quickly want to recognize Sam because he did a lot of work on this as well. One of the first things I kind of inherited when I got here was a really nice memo he prepared outlining some of our options and discussing the Treasury's final rule. So thank you to Sam and thank you to everybody for listening, and we'll open it up to discussion questions.
Thank you, Bob. So you had mentioned essentially using the internal fund and payments here as a money laundry for getting that money back in the general fund. How does that relate to the goal of having these be for one-time uses and not for something that we're essentially working into on a budgeting and then left with a gap at some future point?
So the city hall fund, like if you were to look at that in our CIP, those are essentially a collection of one-time projects. So they're not recurring costs. The number that was up there was sort of the sum of the 5 years of projects that we believe are eligible uses. Things like, replacing a chiller, boiler replacement. So they are one-time costs. It's just that how we calculate, I try to avoid the weeds too much here, but there are certainly city hall maintenance costs that are allocated out to the departments here. Then these one-time capital costs also need to find their way in there so we don't have that fund that's dedicated to city hall maintenance run, a negative cash balance basically. So what this would allow us to do is take what would otherwise be allocations out to the departments, and it's now being funded with ARPA. So it does just free up some money for those departments for you all to consider other ways of using that through our operating budget process.
Hey, Josh, in the case of the chiller, you can certainly argue it's not an expense, right? That it's a planned, useful life expense. So I'll get that point too.
Looking at a 5-year or a 20-year add-on.
Right. And the same as the playground. So we have $5,000, $15,000 replacements of the playgrounds in the CIP. You can make the argument that those are either one-time, meaning if we have the money, we do it. If it doesn't, we have old playground equipment, we don't get new. You can also make a fair argument that, well, no, we know we have so many playgrounds, they last 20 years, we got to do 120. So, you can even argue that with Pothole and South Boston, right? That what's a one-time versus, so I think we're using one-time as a pretty broad, it's going to be outside the 5-year period. We tried to get bigger hitter. I think some of the city hall ones are like convert to LED lights, which you wouldn't have to do necessarily. You could just continue to replace the panels you got, but it's allowing us to leverage. That was the last one in. I'm not sure Josh recommended that to me. I think that was more of me saying, well, I think it's a way to broadly impact a number of departments. It's not just general fund, it's utilities, part of the funders of this, so they would potentially
you'd say you wouldn't have to raise the rates of utilities as much because they're gonna pay a kind of a discount on their space, although we had else in there. There's quite a bit of work for workstations, you know, stand-up desks and other things that, again, I think you could argue you don't necessarily have to replace. It's something that improves the work environment, and we consider kind of a one-time improvement to the office environment. Anything big in there? And we don't know if we're gonna have to do the. Oh, it's not there is the chiller, but there's also a lot of controller cores, which are projects that we've anticipated as an improvement to the building, improving the controllers of all of these systems and stuff. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah. It doesn't help avoid in its entirety the idea that perhaps someday we're gonna replace whatever we're paying for ARPA money now. There's gonna have to be other, but it does do. From a practical stance, this gives us the ability to potentially even charge those funds the same, not bring the rate of the city all down, and start building it up as a single.
So even though we can't use ARPA funds for reserve, if we launder it through this method, then the money that we're saving elsewhere can go with the reserve.
Yes, and we certainly wouldn't use the term launder.
The PCCI and River Falls.
I think it's reasonable to say it is supplanting. I mean, you're taking federal money and supplanting the local. But again, it goes back to this idea of revenue loss. We're using that category, so.
Now, as we look at government spending as a whole, it can have a pretty significant impact on economic activity and inflation. And Scott probably has a better idea on this than I do. But, you know, when we're running, what, 7%?
For inflation, I think it was 7.5 last better, and I think that's low.
So, you know, then we've got $1.75 billion, and honestly, many times that, where we have to make the consideration of, do we want to spend this now and further drive up economic engine at a time of limited labor to meet those needs? Or would it serve our interests better to wait until the next more virulent strain of COVID or the Ukraine conflict crashes the global economy and we can get things for half price?
I wouldn't want, frankly, if I may respond.
No, yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to, you know, the way, I am not sure that it's ever gonna be cheaper to get some of those CIP projects done, the south of Boston Lane and the Hollow and Bridge. I don't see those as ever going down.
So this would be the time.
So my idea would be, you know, let's do it now. So, you know, and then free stuff up at the back end and then figure out what we do with our increased flexibility over the terms of the fiscal plan.
And if I may, I just want to bring one important point up that it was an oversight of mine that I did not have in my presentation, but worth mentioning is we do need to have our funding committed for some eligible use or uses by 2024, and they must be spent by 2026. So I understand that.
Okay, so we don't have,
We don't have like an infinite timeline, right? It's 2 years down.
So 20 years.
that's exactly what I was gonna ask you.
Okay.
The clock is ticking.
Right.
Mr. Council President.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things I want to talk about tonight, and one of them is, one of the best forms of spending, and I learned this at municipal league conferences, is they will make the studies, you can do studies, and they'll fund them in that revenue, the lost revenue we're talking about. And one of the studies I would like to see, and I think people would agree when they look into it, is a really fiscally responsible version of a will tax that's more responsible than the will tax, called the transportation utility. It would be in the form of a transportation utility fee. That would be something I think would be worth everyone's time to look at, and this is a good way of use of spending money to save money.
So just a bit cost.
I would say probably less than the housing study would do. And you would either match or pay it in full, I believe. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is I'd like to see some legislation passed. I'm interested in introducing it where we can have all of our council member, or all of our council meetings, with the ability to publicly comment virtually. So we can spend some of that money the way it's meant to be spent on, the COVID aspect. And today's a good aspect of it too. You know, you're at home, it's winter, you can't necessarily make it to our meetings. Well, if we got the technology, you can make public comment. Here's the catch, you gotta be a River Falls resident. But I believe we might be set up to do what I'm talking about to an extent already. Is that true, Mr. Simpson?
Yeah, I think we are. I don't know that we feel there's a statutory problem with that. Now, some cities have an ordinance that gets in the way that says, you know, it has to be in person or limits people's participation in person. I don't know that we have that challenge, but so I think I understand the first comment, which is you'd be proposing you'd be proposing to the council that we use ARPA funds to do a study, a feasibility study of transportation utility that would likely fit in this definition. As long as we took the revenue exemption, I think that fits within the general government, and that would be a prerogative of the council to do that. So I don't know that there's a project though related to there potentially could be if we have to buy new technology.
That's what I'm getting at.
Or if we have to hire somebody to do, I'm not sure right now that I'm not sure we necessarily need extra staff to do that. So I think what I'm hearing, you're primarily focused on the meetings we're already doing, correct?
Well, just making it normalizing the ability for people to leave a public comment virtually for all of our meetings. It falls under the category of helping people with disabilities who can't necessarily make it here. It also falls under categories such as we're seeing today, where someone, you know, it's winter out, someone can't make it, or if someone wants to comment, but they can't show up, they can do it virtually, and the mayor can limit the amount of time on that. They have to give a River rather than. That's what I'm looking at. That's the crux of what I'm saying.
So I think our expectation is that the modifications of City Hall that were undertaken and are currently planned to be undertaken, so any further modifications to this room likely accommodates what you're talking about. So I don't know if there's a project, but we'll find out.
And it might be worth talking to city staff.
We can look at
software.
Additional software things. I know we're not particularly enamored with, what's the meeting software we use, the software that we used to use. Granicus. So, I mean, there might be a purchase of a new agenda management system or something that would more seamlessly work with the public on their involvement. So we can try to figure that out. I'm not prepared to give you an idea of what that costs or anything for tonight.
I understand that too. Thank you.
Do we have any idea? I know that some people have looked at this before. Do we have any idea of what it would cost to have a wireless Wi-Fi system that would cover the city?
I don't think we have anything documented.
Okay.
I know we had a discussion with a company in combination with, 3 Square. But it's been a number of years ago, and I don't know if I have any documentation yet. But they had basically talked about a wireless network, which was gonna be focused, I think, on downtown and the 2 regional parks, or 3, DeSantis, Hoffman.
Yeah.
So it wasn't citywide, but it was
Public space.
kind of a public space.
From the bid board about wanting to, along with the sound system, we want to explore when we do the Main Street.
That was one of the ones that was specifically enumerated.
For example, I'm meeting tomorrow with AT&T.
Right.
So knock knock. Can you give us some ARPA money? We're AT&T, we're ball and tug. This is not just AT&T, right? It's cities across the country are getting knocks on the door from whatever provider feels best able to get a bunch of money from the Fed. So what, in the case of Pierce Pepin, they're applying. for area, which is primarily in the town of River Falls and the town of Clifton. So they went to the two town boards and said, give us your ARPA money, and we'll use that as part of our application for the federal money. I think Clifton said no, and town of River Falls said yes. So in the case of town of River Falls, they're taking $100,000 of their ARPA money, and they're pledging it to Pierce Pepin Co-op
For the internet.
or broadband to households. And so I expect AT&T's pitch tomorrow will be, we're doing a $9 million rollout. Here's the neighborhoods in River Falls that are going to get it. And wouldn't it be nice for you to give us some of your ARPA money, which as you can see is not part of my.
Let's say that we've got, 4,000 households in River Falls spending $50 a month, that's $2 million a month coming out of River Falls. It's not available to spend in our local businesses or be added to savings. And if we want a economic stimulus program for downtown, having $2 million extra dollars in people's hands to spend every month is pretty significant. Unlike the town of River Falls or Clifton, we don't need to run fiber. We are geographically constrained enough where the wireless systems can meet the needs for a citywide network. Now, I'm no expert on this.
Yeah, and I would tell you that we haven't done any study, so I wouldn't want to quote any prices, but we have not found it particularly difficult to use our existing network to just provide Wi-Fi, which looks a lot like guest Wi-Fi, but is labeled as public Wi-Fi, like the library. I mean, you can, we've added, I don't know if we added 2 or 1 hotspot, basically, or network extender, so that you don't have to be in the 3 spots right next to the library, not like you used to. You can be out and about. It wouldn't be that big of a stretch to do that in parks. I mean, our
Or
fiber.
in parks, but it wouldn't be that big of a stretch using current technology to actually have speed download and upload that is comparable to what people are paying for at their home right now.
Yeah.
In a unified city service that is available to everyone. So you have 4,000 households that don't have a $50 a month expense.
Yeah, so I would guess the best we're able to accomplish right now would be along the lines of what Councilman Downing is suggesting. I mean, it might be, what I might suggest we're talking about is enumerating a feasibility study of downtown Wi-Fi provision. And then you all, obviously you guys have you all have the ability to say, well, I don't want to just do feasibility, I'm actually going to pay $500,000 for the implementation. And we'll come up with a
I
plan.
think 500,000 you can get into address in the city.
Yeah, but does, would that create, a staffing need, a maintenance need? I mean, there's essentially a function that the city does not provide. Now. So it would be an expense going forward.
Correct.
Yeah, I think we have to understand that.
Now, as an economic multiplier, we've got $24 million a year in additional local spending. What's the economic multiplier effect of local spending, Scott? 7, 10. We're looking at $200 million in additional activity a year. The city's 0.5% on sales tax. Geez, that covers a lot of onboard operating expenses, doesn't it?
Time doing something.
Well, I was just gonna say, did you better you said 4,000 homes times $50?
Yeah,
That's
$2 million a month.
200,000 a month.
Oh, 200,000 a month.
That's a different number.
Oops, I did bad there. Okay, so 2.4 million here, not 24.
Yeah.
So our 10 times economic multiplier on that, then is, 20 million, not 240. Which is still pretty significant, a 0.5% sales tax off of $20 million. Help me out here, let's see, 10% would be 2 million. 1% would be 100,000 to $200,000 a year in additional tax revenue, let alone the money that's redistributed to the local economy.
I understand. I would suggest that, and we do have a CLAC license, which I don't know if all of you are aware of. So the city owns a common carrier license. We've maintained the ability to be a phone company. That's something Ms. Bergstrom made sure we kept in compliance with. So We never went to fiber, we installed some fiber potentially for customers. We have fiber for ourselves. I'm not sure what the, you may be right about the practical nature of 500,000 might give us the equipment. But once we provide it, it's,
Well, you still got to pay your 10 cents a kilowatt hour.
well, we may be a public provider, we may be a utility that's regulated, FCC might be, providing at the library, we kind of stay under the radar and nobody's making much of a fuss, but if we said RF Wi-Fi, I think we'd have some other things to consider. We have some other people on our back, not to mention AT&T trying to get the rules changed probably in the legislature, so we can't do that. Comcast and AT&T have already done that once in the state's history, so I think I understand your suggestion. I would say that feasibility would be important before.
So Scott,
I think it is feasible. There are cities that use their CLAC license. Let's see, trying to think of Reedsburg. So Reedsburg Utilities does provide a public Wi-Fi as part of their package, but I don't know enough about it to be dangerous. I just know that it is feasible. Or it's practical. I don't know if it's feasible. 'Cause I don't know if they're making money, losing money. They don't care. They know what they're doing.
You know what, in a perfect world, I've always thought that, fiber cable, Wi-Fi, whatever, ought to be a utility, and the city ought to be able to provide it just like they do with water and electric. But my understanding is that the current laws don't make that quite so easy.
Yeah, it's certainly intentional.
Yeah, so.
Yeah,
What happens when you hire lobbyists to write bills? A lawsuit.
so Scott, can we talk a bit, when you and I met on this, you gave some indication as to doing these projects is going to open up, and Josh referred to it in his presentation, open up some horsepower for us financially later on. Both of those projects, the South Lawson and the Powell Avenue Bridge, would have some form of bonding in it, is that correct? That we would not be doing as part of the CIP that would free up?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say that those are probably going to be borrowed. It's possible that we would use some developer contribution funds that are in the bank already, so to speak, but I doubt it. I think there's so many projects going on that it's unlikely that there's enough in the tank that we would be using cash for that. So yeah, I don't want to make a mistake about what the recommendation is. So I want to give us minimum administration, maximum flexibility. I believe that we've spent a lot of time already as a community and as an elected body establishing priorities, debating them, or getting them in order. So I just took that as I've already got some marching orders. I don't need to create new projects. If it was project 12 of the 10 projects you funded, then I know I should focus on the first 10. Not saying there isn't other opportunities, because this is new money or unanticipated money or whatever. But essentially what it does is it allows us to get around the debt service. If I didn't have the rules saying no debt service or no reserves, that's what I'm telling you. Pay down debt. That's because you take one-time money to pay down debt service and freeze it up. We'll have the fiscal plan. You guys can figure out what's going on. The feds are on to that. They want to spend. They didn't want it to just have the reserves of the banks, because the banks already got it. They want to loan money. They already have a bunch of money. They don't really want us to pay off the debt. So, and they're close with the feds. So they've all decided you can't do that. But essentially, it's going to allow you to not incur some debt, which in a way allows you to reduce your debt, your future levy for debt. And you're about to go into a 2023-24 discussion as a group. and debate and argue and determine what the 2-year resource allocation is gonna be, and you essentially would be sitting on then like 800,000 freed up. And I won't promise you as administrator, if you do that, that I'm gonna give you, my recommendation is gonna give you $800,000 to do projects of your liking. You know, it may be that we have salary pressure that I recommend you use some of it for increasing salaries or compensation. It may be that we have other projects that come on that we didn't know about, when we put the CIP or other things together, but I think what is the practical result is we get the 1.6 through the federal rules, we minimize the amount of money we spend to move the money through from feds to local. It essentially becomes local. Defederalized. And then you have that ability, because I know we have the discipline, we've shown it over time. You have the discipline then because you have a fiscal plan and you're spending things that you plan to spend. It frees that up now for your spending. And it also frees it up for you to say, lower taxes. You know, we don't, let's do that. That also is prohibited under the ARPA. You know, you're not supposed to basically not spend money you were going to spend. I think that's highly unlikely that that's the result, that your 23-24 budget is going to be 800,000 less than what you planned.
Yeah, that's why you can't combine it with the Justice Fund.
So, and then I tried to pick in the CIP projects. I also think that just leaves people longing, right? I was recognizing from a practical standpoint, how can the council vote on something that basically people don't see? You know, it's like, you got this big check from the federal government and you just put it in the bank. Or you're telling us, don't worry, you'll figure something out in 23 or 24. And so what I'm suggesting is you basically put it on some big visible projects. And not only that, when we do the placemaking, it gets you some downtown focus, and the wayfinding gets you some broad city focus, right? So people can point and say, here's things that were paid for by this ARPA. The neighborhood playground equipment is the same way. I mean, you're going to basically be able to hit 5 zones of the city. Not that we're trying to appease people or make it seem like, hey, this is, manna from heaven or something, but it does give people some visible impacts. It also is efficient, right? I can order 5 playgrounds just as easy as I can order 1. It's all done, the administration of it, the contracting, the RP, everything is all done. Same as the weather sirens. We can keep doing 1 weather siren every 3 years and eventually get to it. But every time we order 1 and install 1, we spend 3 weeks with the contractor, calibrating all the rest of them, figuring it all out. And so it's an opportunity to just get the emergency siren system all done. We know public works facility is a little tired and it needs some paint, and so that I think that's is that a study too? The future needs analysis. So part of that money is needs analysis to say what's the public works facility of the future look like. So it gives us some. To Mr. Downing's point, it puts some of this money into helping us learn and be smarter with our money later. And then Collins Park is, again, it's a specific enumerated thing that's already been decided by the park board and the council and everybody that's next on the list. So let's do it. And so if you go to the next slide, Josh, I mean, I do realize you can spend 1.67 million and be the United Way or River Falls. When you have the ability as a council to say, you get a $10,000 grant and you get a $10,000 grant and you get it. Basically, nonprofits are eligible to take the money, right? The Hockey Association has already talked about this in one of their board meetings, and then tried to talk to us about, in a roundabout way of, well, we're a nonprofit, we're eligible. The city could just pay off our mortgage. That is an eligible expense of ARPA. You could pay off the baseball stadium. You have a lot of flexibility.
Except the same hockey stadium that isn't open to the public.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, the same one. You got it. So I don't want to make you think you don't have options. You have lots of options. I am, but that doesn't give me any pause to make the recommendation I did. I think it's a really efficient, effective way for us to put the money into play and give us more flexibility in the future. But it doesn't build a new pool, right? There isn't anything particularly shiny or happy. It doesn't build a new health center or something that we discovered as part of COVID that we really needed in town. It doesn't put in a new transportation system, right? We all know there's needs in the community that we've maybe even seen more acutely through the lens of COVID. My recommendation doesn't address that, and I understand.
But what it does do is it frees up, so I just made a quick list. We got biosolids, we got the dams, we got the Blossom Cascade traffic, North Interceptor, we talked about the bridge, we got the pool. Those are big items that down the road, your recommendation allows us some room to address those for.
Yeah, I believe that's the case.
Okay.
It also will put,
And I didn't include Riverwalk on there, I just want to start.
yeah. No, and you circle. And then one of the other things we talked about, which you guys trying to make sure everybody's got, including Alyssa, if she has comments here. We didn't do the key border plan. And the thinking there was, I primarily was focused on levy funded items because of that reason. It's going to give you more flexibility in the future. You can make the argument, and there's plenty of cities doing it, that helping the utilities has the same impact. In my mind, it does have the same impact, but I would rather, given the makeup of River Falls and its taxable property, I would rather leave utility stuff to utility ratepayers, which is a much broader group and includes nonprofits and the university and everybody else. I'd rather have them help pay for the Kinney Border Plan, or in case of the hydro removal. Everybody's paying for it that way. If I were to recommend to you, just take ARPA money and take out the dam, which I think you could do. It would be considered water, infrastructure. I don't know. We'd have to look at it. That ripple effect is on a much smaller group because it's only taxable properties that are levied on. And as we all know, it's primarily residential taxable properties that have the biggest burden. So, on a pie chart. So that's why I picked the ones I did, because I think, and that's why the city hall was kind of debatable, because it's like, well, maybe we should just fund those, but then not lower the rates to the utilities and the benefits off of the levy, or we should come up with another 160,000 levy projects to do. I think we just looked at the list of things that were for city hall and just thought those are things that good, they benefit the public, they're visible, and not being all at once, so to speak. And when I say all at once, we're thinking this becomes a list of 22 and 23 projects. So I don't think we can get everything done in 22. But we would make some efforts to do things in 22 because of this idea that we want to get the money in. Now I haven't fully thought through the inflationary impact of, do we want to push more money into the economy? That's a real thing. I would say on a local impact for these projects, I wasn't thinking of, I guess I didn't weigh that very much. That is the case, I guess, that you could argue if all cities are pushing their chips on the table right now, that only make inflation worse.
I want to see if Alyssa wants. Alyssa, do you have any questions or any comments or? No, okay.
Are those the actual costs up there for those top two projects, or that's?
That's the local match.
Okay, got it.
I wish.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that doesn't look right.
No, the bridge is $1 million. And, South Boston is 2 point something.
I thought our bridges were an A.
Some,
Paul.
No, Powell is an F.
Maybe I misread that before.
you can see there.
Excuse me. Yeah, no, that's why it struck me, maybe I looked at it wrong.
So roughly $1 million for Powell and 4 million for Boston. And this isn't all of, this wouldn't be 100% of the local funds, because there's water, electric, sewer, stormwater. This is the kind of the street portion of the local match.
Yeah, and so, so that was what we were considering bonding,
Correct.
because we originally, yeah,
Geo bonding.
right.
There might have also been borrowing for water and sewer.
Utility.
I'm not sure on the electric, some undergrounding. Is there new undergrounding on that project?
Boston Lane, yeah, there's a little bit of work.
Yeah. And Powell and Boston are not 22 projects. So those people would see the signs up or whatever. However, we decided to know these, those would be 23. Let's see, Boston. They're not doing any construction this fall. So, yeah, 23. So how we, that's just I guess, as an aside, I would propose we do our big, that's a 4x8, that's a piece of plywood, our big sign that says, infrastructure investment by the city of River Falls, and then we would have, with partners, Wisconsin DOT, and then we have some kind of notation of use of either ARPA or state and local SLR, FR. We'd have to figure out some way to know that we got help. So we would want people to see that. I know that Congress really wants people to see that because Pines office calls me weekly
He's not gonna be there.
to know which projects we funded. So I said, we haven't funded that yet. We're trying to decide how to wisely use the money first. So we didn't do the water tower either, which was would have been an easy way to just, boom, put the 1.7 million into the water tower. But again, I just thought, water tower has such a broad customer base. It has reasonable, healthy revenues. Why wouldn't you just pay for the water tower out of water revenues? If I was the village of something, population 900 in Wisconsin, my recommendation would be to use it for the new water tower, right? Because they're desperate to get that thing up. Plus, they can leverage their ARPA for clean water, distressed area, and probably get half of the water tower paid. We can't do that.
When you think of that, Joe, you could have Scott paid for by ARPA funds.
But we get back to us.
So from a technical standpoint, I haven't vetted this through the city attorney yet. If you were to accept their administrator's recommendation, it's unlikely that I need any further authorization from the council legally to implement the plan. As you pass a budget, you obviously, when we bid this out, you'd have to approve the bids and then we demonstrate where the funding sources and that, but there may be a budget adjustment that you have to authorize at the end of 22 or 23 to do it, but I probably, within the purchasing policy, statutory authority as an official acting on your behalf, I probably can lay this out. I don't think I would just do that. I think, our thought as staff, or my thoughts anyways, is some kind of resolution to council that says here's, whereas we got this money from the feds, whereas we've examined how to use it, whereas we're going to take the revenue, exemption, whereas the city administrator is authorized to do that. We probably don't need to, but it would be helpful, I think. Also to just make sure you guys get the ability in a public format to say this is what you want to do. And then frankly, you can amend, you'd have the ability then at that format to say, this sheet is not the sheet we want, the final sheet. No, and you could, somebody could make a motion to take out 60,000 from City Hall and put in 60,000 for a feasibility study or whatever you want to do. So that's kind of what I would see next steps, unless the council has objection to that being how we proceed.
Strong poll.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I think so. I'm okay with that.
And that would include a feasibility study for I talked about then.
I would not. I would stick with my recommendations. And I would let you all decide if you want to make amendments.
Well, I'd like to be able to make that amendment later. Otherwise, I like what we said.
Yes. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
No, I think it's, yeah, as you said, I mean, these are things we prioritize, we've budgeted for, and just to be able to pay these without going into any development, bring things out to do more of these in the future is gonna,
Alyssa,
speed things out. So,
Alyssa, how do you feel about the plan that's presented?
I feel good about it. I just missed this part. This is the only question I realized I had. Is this money being, I know that the money isn't all here yet, but is this all being for, and we have to use it by 2026, is that what I think I heard? But like, is this all being done in the next year or two, or how long would this take for these monies to be used? Otherwise, I'm fine with it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think our plan would be to have them spent by the end of 23. And we don't get the second half until this June. So we don't have the 1.7 right now. We have 850,000 or so, roughly speaking. And then, and I would suggest to any of you that has, I've got a couple of things, Mr. Plunkett's, I can try to figure out what the feasibility might be and maybe dig and see if I can find stuff we've already done. Doesn't take us any work to pull that up.
Yeah, I think the old stuff is, it's not even worth your effort looking at the old stuff 5 years exactly.
Yeah, probably new technology.
Yeah.
And then,
But yeah,
so if you have things that you're contemplating amending, it would at least be helpful for Sam, Josh, be able to estimate what the cost is and then run it through the ringer to make sure that it fits. I think it would, because if we're taking the revenue, you've got a pretty wide ability, but I suppose there's things you could come up with as a council person that would not be eligible. And I would rather just tell you that ahead of time than have you make an amendment and then public meeting me say you can't do that. Or at least know that we're gonna tell you that. Maybe you want to bring it up anyways, but we would tell you that in the meeting.
I was gonna say that the US Treasury Department has a really good, Q&A question spot if anyone has questions about it. Baker Tilly has a nice overview too, if people have general questions about the process. So.
Okay. So they can get your direction.
Okay. Is the council interested in having another workshop on this, or do you want us to just draft it up and get it on some future regular agenda?
How people would be
You can probably go draft it up.
Yeah. Melissa, you okay with moving forward? Yep, okay. What's up? All right.
Anything else you got, Josh?
Nope.
That's it.
Thank you, Josh.
Appreciate Sam and Josh's work on
Thanks,
this.
Sam. Other than that, I think we're adjourned until the council meeting.
Technically, show You all have hats, the focus hats in your, we consider that you advertising our process. It's not. I don't get to run that fast. Yeah.